The skin on Robert Holding's feet was gone. His boots had rotted off weeks ago. Every step on the frozen volcanic rock tore at him like knives. He hadn't seen the sun in days. There was nothing but sleet, wind, and the gaunt faces of men too weak to stand. Some of them were already dead, while others were just simply dying. One of the men had stopped speaking entirely, desperately clawing shellfish off the rocks and trying to eat them with his shaking hands. There was no fire, no food, and no plan. And their captain? He hadn't even left his shelter in days. He sat alone, wrapped in his coat, letting the others bring him what scraps remained. Without his leadership, it was every man for himself, and Robert Holding saw the decline. He heard the whispers, men talking about eating the dead. It was hell on earth, and every day, it somehow got a little worse. But here's what none of them knew. Only 20 miles south, on the very same island, another ship had wrecked, just 4 months earlier. And here was another crew locked in their own fight to survive. Two stories unfolding side by side with two very different outcomes. This is the story of two shipwrecks, impossibly close to each other, and their crews pushed to the edge of survival. How they can make it out of this alive is the question we're going to try and answer today, so stick with me. In May of 1864, the Invercauld slips out of Melbourne under heavy skies bound for South America. She's a three-masted merchant vessel, 175 feet from stern to stern, and built for crossing oceans, but certainly not built for comfort. Right now, she's light in the water. She had barely any cargo except some spare timber, basic provisions like salted pork and hardtack. It also carried with it several barrels of fresh water which were lashed below deck. It was enough to get her to Peru, assuming nothing went wrong. There were 25 men aboard, some officers, but mostly working hands, and among them was Robert Holding. He was only 23 years old. He was lean and sharp-eyed. He had callous hands from years of work and a cautious temper. He was born in England but raised at the sea. This certainly wasn't his first voyage, but it would be the one that would stay with him forever. At the helm was Captain George Delgarno. He ran a tight ship. For him, there was a clear hierarchy between him, an officer, and those below him. He had a very stiff protocol, and he left little room for the crew to ask questions. When the ship left port, although no one said it outright, the crew was uneasy. Their rations were minimal, and they knew the weather ahead wasn't going to be forgiving. Sailing south into the sub-Antarctic and facing dangerous winds at those latitudes. By mid-May, the Invercauld was deep into the Southern Ocean, south of New Zealand. They're now in the grip of what's called the Auckland Islands, jagged black volcanic rocks rising out of the sea like broken teeth. They're isolated, uninhabited, there are no harbors, and no rescue depots. Out here, there's no way for them to call for help. In May, they're edging into the southern winter. Daytime temperatures hover just above freezing. At night, it could dip below zero. On the islands, the wind howled through the cliffs like it was trying to peel the skin off your bones. And worse still, as they're trying to round the islands, their navigation began to fail. The sun ended up vanishing behind thick clouds for days. They had no horizon and no bearings, and without clear sky, they couldn't take a sight to pick their direction. Their compass offered little comfort, it was unstable in the storm surge, and every heading felt like a guess, so they had to fall back to old methods, dead reckoning, using distance, speed, and drift, all estimated and all uncertain. And this went on for days. The crew had been sailing blind, skirting the islands. There was no sun, no stars, just dense fog and endless cloud cover. And then, on the early morning of May 10th, through the fog and cold spray, they heard it. It was the surf crashing close, way too close. They had ventured dangerously close to shore, and they knew at this point one wrong turn would mean disaster. Then, sometime before dawn, it happened. There was a jolt. The keel slammed against the rock. The sound of timber cracking echoed through the hull. The ship shuddered hard, as if it had been caught in a giant's grip. Moments later, there was another crash, even louder. The hull split open and water surged in. There were no orders given. It was pure chaos. A wave lifted the stern, the beams buckled, and men were thrown from their bunks into the rising seawater. Some managed to claw their way back onto the deck, others were swept straight into the sea. At this point, the weather and the wind had weakened, but the surf around the island was still violent, and in the dark it was impossible to see what was wreckage and what was shore. Those who could jumped, and they grasped at floating timbers, barrels, even the shattered lifeboats as they floated away. Screams were swallowed by the howling wind and the waves breaking on shore. By morning, only 19 men actually made it to land. 6 had died and were lost to the sea. Here they stood on a narrow beach, barefoot, bleeding, soaked to the skin. They had no shelter, no fire, just a single crate of ship's biscuits, salted pork, and a few soaked matches. That was it. Everything else had gone down with the ship. Among the survivors was Robert Holding. He had years of seafaring behind him, but none of it had prepared him for this. His feet were completely torn from the rocks, his hands shook from the cold, but somehow he was alive, and so were the others. These guys literally made it off the boat because it was the middle of the night with no footwear. So they're in a survival situation. I couldn't imagine what that would be like with no shoes. Probably sucks a lot. But for the next 2 days, these guys were in shock. They stayed close to the wreck site, half huddled in a narrow cove, battered by the sea spray and wind. They weren't able to put together a shelter big enough for the 19 survivors. The survivors scavenged whatever the tide had dragged up to sea. They were able to get a single axe head, some coils of rope, a few broken planks, and some torn sailcloth. It took hours to get a fire going. They were able to coax the wet driftwood to actually burn, but it didn't put off a lot of heat. It was literally better than nothing. They tried to dry their clothes, but the mist from the sea never paused long enough for them to actually do it. Everything at the camp stayed damp. The skin on their feet began to split from always being wet. Over the next few days, they would develop saltwater ulcers all around their feet. There was nothing but these shellfish called limpets that they would pick from the rock to eat. Some tried to eat them raw, while others couldn't keep them down. Captain Delgarno, at this point, he's literally non-existent. He gave no orders, he simply sat there in shock, not knowing what to do. He sat apart from the rest, wrapped in his coat and silent. He never lifted a hand to help, and the men started to realize he was no longer their captain. They would whisper about it and argue, but at the end, nobody stepped up to take control. After the first few nights, one of the crew who was already weak from the wreck stopped responding to people talking to him. He slipped into what appeared to be a deep hypothermia, and he died before the next morning, curled against a rock wall. They had no way to bury him. The next day, they made a decision. The beach wouldn't sustain them, so they knew they couldn't stay. They needed to move, and move fast. They needed higher ground, which would give them a chance for better shelter. Maybe they'd be able to find animals to hunt, maybe seals, maybe sea lions, which they knew were around the islands. They made the decision to leave in search of these better conditions for survival, but in front of them, they had to make a very important choice. They had to decide to go north or go south. And these men, they chose to go north. A decision that would change their fate forever. What they didn't know, or could have even known, was that 20 miles to the south, another fire was already smoking. Another crew had wrecked there 4 months earlier, and they were still alive and had the means to survive. But the Invercauld men had turned the other way. Alright, those guys turned the wrong way, but I don't want to. So I'm going to keep this as short as possible. This is a small and independent channel. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but YouTube finally accepted us into the partner program thanks to your support. So every subscriber really does count. And with that, I'm going to shut up and let's move on. On the opposite end of the island, tucked inside the sheltered waters of Carnley Harbor, the Grafton was anchored when a storm hit. Winds howled and the rain lashed at the ship sideways. And then one of the anchor chains broke and the little schooner was tossed around like a toy until it slammed into the rocks and broke apart. 5 men scrambled ashore, soaked and shivering, but somehow alive. No one was lost in the actual wreck. There was no real chaos, but they all had a grim understanding that they were marooned and that help wasn't coming. And here they were, on the same island, the same wilderness, but with a very different beginning. So the Grafton hadn't actually come out on some grand expedition. It was a modest venture, which was meant to be a prospecting trip, meant to scout the area for minerals in and around the Auckland Islands. 5 men were aboard, and all were capable, and all of them used to hardship. At the helm was Captain Thomas Musgrave. He was calm, level-headed, and respected. He was a man who earned his authority by building trust with his men and not simply by his rank. Beside him was Francois Reynal, a French sailor turned adventurer. He was quiet, resourceful, and brilliant in crisis. The kind of man who would make tools from scrap and solutions from thin air. When the Grafton wrecked, there was no panic. no shouting, and no breakdown. They hit the shore running, hauling sails, food, tools, and even a shotgun. Whatever could be saved, they saved. And they did it together. They had a leader who insisted on no hoarding, no arguing, and only cooperation. And from that very first day, they were thinking like survivors. Musgrave, he wasn't barking orders from some dry rock at his men. He wasn't waiting around for his men to feed him and carry out all the tasks he didn't want to do. He was there in the muck with them, with his sleeves rolled up, his hands raw, and already planning for what would come next. During the first days on shore, there was no complex planning because they knew their first priority had to be fire. They used soaked rags and driftwood to get a fire going. They knew how valuable this fire was and did everything to guard it fiercely, even building a shelter around it to keep the wind, rain, and sea spray off of it. They knew next they would need food. And lucky for them, there were sea lions everywhere. They were massive, loud, and dangerous. But for them, they were meat. And that meant survival. Francois Reynal and Captain Musgrave led the first hunting attempts, creeping close to harvest young bulls with clubs. It was bloody and exhausting work, but they learned fast. Also, saving their shotgun and ammunition in case they really needed it. They were able to dry and smoke the meat and render the fat for oil. Rendering that fat for oil would have been so valuable to these guys. Not only is it super nutritious if you got to eat it, it's also great for heat and light. Now, being smart enough to know that they had to dry their meat and kind of plan for the future really showed that these guys were thinking about surviving a long time on that island. They were able to use that blubber or the oil that they rendered down to make handmade lamps. They ended up using the bones to make tools. The stomachs and guts of the animals that they harvested were actually cleaned and used to store liquids that they needed. Literally nothing from these animals was wasted. From where these guys landed, they were actually able to find fresh water in some inland streams. And again, they ended up storing it in these sea lion stomachs. It's pretty gross, but I guess it's kind of what you got to do in that situation. Once they took care of food, fire, and water, they knew they could spend some time bolstering up their shelters and salvaging what they could from the wreck. They were able to get timber, nails, and canvas, and even salvage one of the Grafton's lifeboats. They chose a spot near a freshwater stream out of the wind's direct path. The first version of their shelter was a crude hut, mostly canvas and some driftwood, barely enough for the men to sleep under. But as the weeks passed, they improved their shelter bit by bit. They sealed the gaps the wind tore through with moss, and they even built small bunks. To keep the area free of smoke, they even built a chimney. It was said that Reynal even gave the little hut a name, and they called it the Invercauld. And from the historical records, nobody really knows what it meant. It could have been a play on words from French, but it is what they need. Now, inside that tiny shelter, under Musgrave's leadership, these 5 men began to make a life. And seriously, this is only possible because of the leadership and cooperation that was going on. These guys did incredible things. They were able to stitch boots from seal hide. They even brewed their own beer using wild roots. And Reynal, the tinkerer, even forged new tools from iron recovered from the wreck, melting it down in a homemade forge built from rocks and bellows made from scrap. He literally made needles, fishing hooks, and at one point they even used some of the fat from the seals and sea lions to make their own soap. These men kept a very important routine, keeping Sundays for rest and prayer, and they even took time to teach each other new skills. They even had a little classroom where they could give lessons in teaching each other how to speak each other's language. They took time to play chess and even spent time arguing over games of cards. Seriously, it's pretty wild what these guys accomplished. It reminds me so much of the story I covered last week on Alexander Selkirk. Though he was by himself, he was able to not just survive, he made a life on an island with all his ingenious life hacks. It's not to say that it was always easy for these guys. They still faced cold, hunger, the psychological toll of being ripped away from what they know and their families. And the only thing that they really had was to rely on each other. But somehow, day by day, these guys simply stopped just surviving and started thriving. It was such a stark contrast to the crew of the Invercauld, who was trying to survive just miles away. And these two groups completely unaware of each other. In truth, though, it wasn't just a stark contrast. Rather, it was a heartbreaking one, because further up the coast, the other crew was completely unraveling. After just days on the cove with no shelter and no leadership and barely a scrap of food, the Invercauld survivors had made the call to leave the wreck in search of salvation. they had a simple choice, to go north or to go south. And they had chose north. But they hadn't chosen it for no reason, because some of the men among them had heard rumors of an old British outpost in that direction. It was a place once known as Hardwick. It was a sliver of hope. There may be supplies and there may be shelter. But even at the start of the journey, they faced danger. They had to climb an impossibly steep and rocky cliff to even leave the coast. But they really had no choice, so they started climbing. Barefoot, soaked, weak from scurvy, and up cliff streaked with moss and sharp volcanic rocks. Partway up, one of the men lost their grip and slipped and fell. They just simply left his body behind, eventually being claimed by the sea. Eventually, they reached the top of the cliff, a place high above the sea and spray. It didn't give them a lot of relief. They couldn't really see much through the fog, and they weren't really able to determine their direction with any ease. But they did spot one sign of hope. There was hoofprints from feral pigs that were left behind by early sailors. Now, this was a common practice back then, as I mentioned in other episodes, but leaving animals like pigs and goats on islands so that if you either returned or you ever needed to on your way somewhere, you could pick some up or hunt them and bolster up your meat supplies. It was kind of like a free-range farm, I guess, back in that day. But unfortunately for the men, finding those hoofprints gave them only a glimmer of hope, because they had no guns, they had no traps, and they barely had enough strength to walk. They were never able to actually hunt any pigs. The only hope really lied in reaching that remote outpost which laid ahead of them. One that nobody was sure actually existed. Now, day after day, they stumbled through dense fog and freezing rain. They had no trail or map to follow, and their feet were swollen and almost rotten. Every little bit of food that they were able to bring, all the shellfish they had scraped off the rocks and saved, ended up being eaten fairly early in the journey, so these guys were absolutely starving. And by the time they reached one of the northern inlets of Auckland Island called Port Ross, only 10 of the 18 men who survived the initial wreck were even left. They slowly had died one by one of starvation, weakness, and the elements. But they knew this British outpost called Hardwick laid somewhere along the shores of this inlet. It was the only thing that kept them going, and they continued to stumble and walk until finally they reached it. But instead of relief of finally reaching their salvation in Hardwick, they were met with absolute dread. The settlement they dreamed of was all but gone. It had existed, but the cabins were collapsed and swallowed by moss. There was nothing but rusted iron fittings and some broken stone chimneys. There was a crumbling pier already sinking back into the ocean. There was no supplies left in the collapsed building, there was no good soil, and the outpost appeared as if it had been abandoned for at least a decade. But for now, at least, some of the collapsed building offered shelter for the men. And for these guys who were half mad with hunger and literally soaked to the bone, it was better than nothing. They moved their stuff into one of the broken down shelters and piled damp moss in the corners for bedding. They started to plug some of the holes in the walls and the roof with seaweed. It said that some of the roofs leaked constantly and the walls barely offered shelter from the wind. Robert Holding was watching the group slowly fall apart. The stress of not finding this cabin really drove everybody kind of mad. They did everything they could to survive, but it was also disorganized. They tried to fish using lines made from sail threads and hooks hammered from scraps of metal, but caught nothing. They even resorted to boiling seaweed and eating moss. When they could find scraps of shellfish along the shore, they would fight over it, because every calorie became a matter of survival, and for some, maybe a matter of pride. Captain Delgarno offered absolutely nothing to help. He chose one of the most intact huts and stayed there and did literally nothing. He waited for others to bring him food, and when it came, he just simply ate and said nothing. He never led the men, he never spoke, and he never acted. The title of captain meant absolutely nothing now. When one of the men became too weak to walk, others carried him into a hut, laid him on the bare wooden floor, and left him there. He died in silence. Nobody mourned, nobody made a grave, because they just didn't have the energy. The rest of them just simply sat by the fires, thin and red-eyed, staring out across the empty sea, as if they were simply waiting to die. One morning, 4 men set off from the ruins of Hardwick. They told the others they were going hunting. They said they spotted signs of seal trails farther inland, maybe even pigs. It wasn't unusual for small groups to often split off to scour the coast, looking for salvage or animals, and no one really questioned it. But Holding noticed something when they left. They didn't bring any real gear, but what he didn't know at the time is while those men were out there to hunt, they were also being driven mad with hunger. And here they were, far from camp and huddled in the wind. Hunger gnawing at them harder than the cold was. They had nothing, no food, no real plan. It's at this point that an idea enters their heads. It was one that was rooted in old maritime tradition. One meant for the most desperate moments you could face. One man suggested that they draw lots, that the loser would be eaten by the other three. Three of the men agreed, but the other didn't. They simply sat in a ring with the wind flattening the grass around them. For the guy that didn't agree, he knew that he might as well have drawn the short straw at this point. He saw the look on the other's face. He knew what would happen if he stayed. He made a run for it as fast as he could. He scrambled up the slope, half mad with fear, bleeding from the rocks, but lucky for him, the other three didn't have the energy to chase him. The three men that he left behind were actually never seen or heard from again. Whether they took off in cowardice or tried to eat each other, we just don't know. I don't think it was to any of the people at camp surprised when that man came back and told that story. Back at camp, believe it or not, Holding, as he's seeing everything unfold, he saw something much worse than what that guy had went through. He returned early one evening, taking the long path behind the ruins, and in the half-light behind a crumbled wall, he stopped cold. There, crouched beside one of the dead, was a man he knew. The figure didn't move fast, it didn't even flinch. It just worked methodically, slicing flesh from one leg with a curved sliver of scrap iron, folding it into cloth and tucking it away. Not in desperation, in a calm and calculated way. For the rest of his life, Holding would never say exactly who this man was or report it. He simply said there was no point. And after that, though, the men started to keep their distance from each other. They would eat in silence and sleep with one eye open. For these guys, day after day, just became more of a routine of waiting to die than actually trying to survive. And unfortunately for them, winter was coming again. And here they were, with no food, no hope of rescue, and probably no future. They weren't planning any kind of escape, they were just surviving day by day. Meanwhile, not too far to the south, in a sheltered cove near Carnley Harbour, Musgrave and the crew of the Grafton were alive and focused. After a year stranded on the southern end of Auckland Island, the Grafton men had enough. They wanted to take that one final gamble. With winter coming again and no rescue in sight, they decided to build their own way out. The men repurposed every scrap they could. Iron from the wreck was hammered into bolts and braces. Seal bones became glue. Old canvas and steel hide were stitched into a sail. Even the caulking was improvised using flax soaked in ash and oil. Rennell's blubber-fired forge roared day and night. Nothing was wasted. The vessel they built was tiny and barely seaworthy, but it was their only hope. On July 19, 1865, two of the men pushed their homemade boat into the surf. Musgrave and Rennell would make the journey, and it was said that their voyage was literally a nightmare. They faced towering waves and lashing rain. They ended up losing their compass, and all their drinking water was spoiled. By the 8th day, while they were exhausted and delirious, they ended up spotting land, and thank God they did, because they were at the end of their rope. But here they were, landing in New Zealand. Musgrave acted fast. Within hours, he reached the town of Invercauld and secured a rescue ship, the Flying Scud. He made a promise to come back for the three that were left behind. And only weeks later, the Flying Scud returned to Carnley Harbour. The seal camp still stood, smoke rose from the chimney, and the three men they left behind were still alive. The final death toll for the Grafton crew, 0. 5 men went in, and 5 men came. The same could not be said for those on the north end of the island. As time went on, they simply just spent their days waiting for either rescue or to die, barely making it by on scraps of seaweed and whatever shellfish they could find. By the time Robert Holding and the last of the Invercauld crew ended up being found, it was nearly a year after they wrecked, and only 3 men survived. There had been no boat building, no seal meat, no long-term strategy, just slow starvation, hypothermia, and silence. The rescue did not come through any plan, literally out of sheer luck. It was May of 1865 when a ship called the Julian happened to pass through Port Ross. It anchored briefly in the northern inlet. A sailor scanning the shoreline noticed something. Faint movement among the brush and tree line. Curious, the captain ordered a small boat ashore. What they found was worse than expected. The men were literally skeletal and barely able to walk. Their clothes were in tatters, their faces hollowed by hunger and exposure. They moved like ghosts among the ruins of Hardwick, dragging their limbs and avoiding eye contact. The huts were falling apart, half choked with moss and rot. Nearby, they found bones scattered in the grass. Maybe animal, maybe not. Of the original 25 men who had wrecked with the Invercauld, only 3 survived. Robert Holding, John McFarlane, and somehow Captain George Delgarno. They had endured the final months in isolation, barely speaking, each keeping to their own corner, their own fire, and simply sitting with their own thoughts. There had been no leadership, no group effort, just day-to-day scrounging, and the shared realization that they were truly on their own. The crew of the Julian brought these guys aboard, fed them and gave them clothes. They were treated kindly, but observers noted how broken they looked, how they flinched at any noise, and how their eyes never really met yours. They had survived, but this coast was brutal, and it truly took a toll on these guys' minds. And somehow, during that entire ordeal, neither the crew of the Grafton or the Invercauld ever crossed paths. And for an entire year, they existed less than 20 miles apart, separated only by fog, distance, and fate. One had built, cooperated, and escaped. The other had broken down into fragments until only a handful remained. When they finally returned home, the reaction for the 2 crews was very different. Grafton survivors were met with admiration. Newspapers in Australia and New Zealand called their escape heroic. It was a testament to their ingenuity, endurance, and leadership. Musgrave's steady hand, Reynolds' resourcefulness, and the crew's cooperation were praised in editorials and journals alike. Rennell even published a memoir called Wrecked on a Reef, which sold widely and helped preserve the story for generations. Their survival became a point of national pride and proof that even on the edge of the world, courage and discipline could prevail. But the Invercauld tale was far more complicated. There were no parades, no speeches, and Robert Holding eventually did write a short account about it, but it was clinical and detached. Captain Delgarno refused all interviews and kept to himself. The public was left with fragments of vague testimony, rumors, and the lingering sense of shame. And then the whisper started to come. There was cannibalism and the drawing of lots to see who would be eaten, and rumors of flesh cooked over driftwood fire. These were never formally confirmed, but neither were they denied. The evidence left at the site was disturbing enough: bones, scattered remains, and silence. And Holding's account that he saw somebody eating flesh and that it was reported to him that some of the crew did draw lots in deciding whether or not to eat each other. There was a maritime inquiry, as was customary after any British shipwreck, but it didn't last long. The court found no cause for criminal action, and simply these guys were just judged by the public. No one was really punished, and no one was really celebrated either. The Invercauld became a cautionary tale, a grim study in failure of planning and leadership and morale. Whereas Musgrave's men built tools and held to principles, Delgarno's crew descended into chaos and mistrust. This is truly another story, just like I've mentioned in the story about Franklin, Shackleton, and a lot of these survival stories I tell. There's a recurring theme where people survive because of good leadership, and people die because of lack of it. It really does seem to ring true in all of these stories. What crazy luck to both be marooned on the same island and not know about each other. One thrives while the other dies. It truly is a mind-boggling story. Well, I want to thank you for joining in today. As I've said in the past, if you like this video, let me know by hitting that like button so that I know to make more of this type of content. Other than that, I'm going to be back again next week with another survival story I don't think you're going to want to miss. So we'll see you then, and thanks again.